500 silver giants vanished the sun. 520 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses lifted into the Pacific sky bound for Tokyo. What happened on the night of May 23, 1945 wasn't just a raid, it was a revelation, a demonstration of industrial power so absolute it rewrote the rules of strategic warfare forever. Most people know about the atomic bombs, but almost no one knows about the night America showed Japan that defeat was not a question of if but merely when. You're about to discover how the largest bombing formation ever assembled changed the course of history in a single night. The Pacific darkness still clung to the islands. Guam, Tinian, Saipan. Across these three specks of coral in the Mariana chain, steel stirred to life. Engines rumbled across dozens of runways, men moved like shadows between the hulking bombers, every breath carried the smell of aviation fuel and salt spray. On that morning, May 23, 1945, history was about to be written in fire. Staff Sergeant William Bannon crouched beneath the belly of a machine unlike any the world had seen before. The B-29 Superfortress tail number 783 stretched above him, 141 feet of wingspan, 99 feet of fuselage, 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each capable of producing 2,200 horsepower. He ran his hand along the smooth aluminum skin. This bomber had already completed 11 missions over Japan. 11 times it had carried death across 1,500 miles of ocean and returned. The Superfortress was no ordinary aircraft, it was America's answer to distance, to defenses, to the very idea that Japan could hide behind the vastness of the Pacific and survive. Beyond the airfields the ocean stretched calm and infinite, but the stillness was deceptive. Intelligence had confirmed the target, downtown Tokyo south of the Imperial Palace, the Yamanote district densely packed with wooden homes interlaced with small factories that fed Japan's crumbling war machine. The mission planners had been clear, this would not be precision bombing, this would be incineration. Somewhere on that distant island Japanese civilians slept in their paper and wood homes, convinced perhaps that the worst had passed, that the March raids were an aberration. They had no idea, because in just hours the sky itself would become their enemy and the B-29 would prove what industrial supremacy truly meant. The invincible Zero had once ruled these skies. The myth of Japanese air superiority had once seemed unshakable. But that was 1941. This was 1945, and the balance of power had not merely shifted, it had been obliterated. What happened that night would not simply be remembered as one more raid, it would be remembered as the moment when Japan understood that resistance was futile, that American factories could produce bombers faster than Japanese fighters could shoot them down, that the war was already over even if the fighting had not yet stopped. Only 4 years earlier the story had been very different. December 1941, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, one victory after another. American bombers then were obsolete, fragile machines that could barely reach the enemy, let alone hurt him. The B-17 Flying Fortress was impressive, but its range was limited. The B-24 Liberator could fly farther, but still not far enough. If America wanted to strike Japan itself, it needed something revolutionary. By early 1940, Boeing engineers had begun work on what seemed impossible, a bomber that could fly over 30,000 feet, carry 10 tons of bombs, travel more than 3,000 miles, and fight its way through enemy defenses with remote-controlled gun turrets. The specifications seemed like science fiction. But Boeing delivered. The XB-29 first flew in September 1942. It was colossal, 99 feet long with a wingspan wider than some city blocks. For massive radial engines gave it power beyond anything previously imagined. But power was only part of the story. The B-29 featured pressurized crew compartments allowing men to operate at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe. It carried 12 50 caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets directed by an analog computer that calculated airspeed, gravity, temperature, even barrel wear. This was not just a bomber, it was a flying fortress of the future. By late 1944, the first B-29s reached the Mariana Islands. Pilots like Major Thomas Murphy knew instantly this was different. The B-17 had felt strong. The B-24 had felt adequate. The B-29 felt unstoppable. It climbed with authority. It cruised at altitudes where Japanese fighters gasped for air. It could absorb punishment from flak and keep flying. And most importantly, it was simple enough that even replacement crews fresh from training could handle it. But machines alone don't win wars. Behind every superfortress was something greater, the relentless engine of American industry. While Japan struggled to replace even a few dozen aircraft each month, United States factories were building hundreds. Boeing plants in Wichita, Kansas and Renton, Washington, Bell Aircraft in Marietta, Georgia, Martin in Omaha, Nebraska, all churning out B-29s at a pace that seemed supernatural. By May 1945, the XXI Bomber Command based in the Marianas had more than 500 operational B-29s. The math was brutal, and so by 1945 the balance had shifted irreversibly. The stage was set in the Mariana Islands. Guam, Tinian, Saipan, tiny volcanic specks scattered across the Pacific but priceless in strategic value. Whoever controlled them controlled the ability to strike Japan itself. By late 1944, American forces had seized them at terrible cost. Now they were fortresses of concrete and steel. Runways stretched for miles, fuel depots held millions of gallons of aviation gasoline, ordnance bunkers stored tens of thousands of tons of bombs. Major General Curtis LeMay commanded the XXI Bomber Command, a man who believed in results, not excuses. LeMay was blunt, profane, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of victory. When he arrived in the Marianas in January 1945, the bombing campaign was failing. B-29s were flying at 30,000 feet, dropping bombs that the jet stream blew miles off target. Losses were acceptable, but results were abysmal. Japanese industry kept functioning. Japanese morale remained intact. Something had to change. LeMay studied the problem with cold logic. High-altitude bombing wasn't working. Precision strikes against individual factories weren't working. The jet stream winds at 25,000 feet were too strong. Cloud cover obscured targets. The solution was radical: strip the bombers of most defensive guns to carry more bombs, fly at night at low altitude 5 to 9,000 feet, use incendiaries instead of high explosives, burn entire districts, not individual buildings. It was ruthless. It was brutal. But LeMay believed it would work. On the night of March 9th into 10th, 1945, LeMay tested his theory. 334 B-29s took off for Tokyo carrying incendiary bombs. The results were catastrophic. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned, 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in history, more deadly than Dresden, more deadly even than the atomic bombs that would come later. The March raid proved incendiaries worked. But LeMay wasn't finished. Through April and May 1945 the raids continued. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Japanese cities burned one after another. By mid-May, LeMay was ready for something unprecedented. He would send every operational B-29 in the Marianas against Tokyo in a single night. The logistics were staggering. 520 aircraft. Over 5,800 crewmen. More than 3,000 tons of incendiary bombs. The mission would require perfect coordination. Bombers would take off at intervals, lift into the darkness, navigate 1,500 miles of open ocean, find their targets in the night, drop their loads, and return. Any mistake, weather, mechanical failure, navigation error, could turn triumph into disaster. Major Thomas Murphy walked the flight line on the afternoon of May 23rd. He was 32 years old, a veteran of 23 previous missions. His crew called their B-29 the Silver Streak Tail No. 497. Murphy had flown her since January. She had never let him down. He looked at the bomb bay doors open, revealing the cluster bombs inside. E-46 incendiary clusters, each one containing 38 M69 bomblets filled with napalm. When those bombs hit, they would punch through roofs, ignite 3 to 5 seconds later, and spray burning gel that stuck to everything. Wood, paper, cloth, flesh. Unstoppable. Around him the pre-flight rituals continued. Ground crews loading bombs, checking engines, testing the remote gun turrets. Radio operators calibrating their equipment. Navigators studying charts. Bombardiers reviewing target photos. Every man knew this mission was different. 520 bombers. The largest formation ever assembled in the Pacific. This was not just a raid, this was a statement. Captain David Kellerman, Bombardier on City of Los Angeles, stood in the briefing room as Colonel Samuel Preston outlined the mission. Preston was tall, gray-haired, his voice carried the weight of command. "Gentlemen," Preston said, pointing at the map, "tonight we strike Tokyo again. Not precision targets, not military installations. We burn the heart of their capital. We show them what American industrial power means. Every bomber that can fly will fly. Every bomb that can be loaded will be loaded. The target is the Yamanote district south of the Imperial Palace. It is densely populated. It contains hundreds of small factories, workshops, suppliers. When we are finished, it will not exist. The room fell silent. 520 bombers. Over 3,000 tons of incendiaries. Kellerman felt the weight of it. This wasn't war as he had imagined it back in training. This was something else. This was annihilation. Beside Murphy stood his co-pilot Lieutenant James Morrison, barely 24, dark hair, sharp eyes. Morrison had only joined the crew in April, but he flew like a veteran. Think they'll put up much of a fight? Morrison asked. Murphy shook his head. Their fighters are finished. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, will see some flak, but nothing like Germany. This is about showing them it's over. Morrison nodded. The truth was undeniable. Japanese air defenses had collapsed. In March they had sent up hundreds of fighters. By May they sent up dozens. Most were obsolete. Most pilots had less than 50 hours training. Against the armada about to take off, they would be gnats against a hurricane. The afternoon sun blazed across North Field, Guam. Across the runways engines began to cough to life. One by one the Wright R-3350s roared their distinctive deep-throated growl. Propellers bit the air. The sound built like thunder rolling across the Pacific. In 3 hours it would be dusk. In 4 hours the first bombers would be airborne. In 10 hours Tokyo would burn. The order came at 1700 hours. Start engines. Major Thomas Murphy climbed into the cockpit of the Silver Streak. The interior was cramped but organized. Instruments glowed faintly in the afternoon light. He settled into the left seat, Lieutenant Morrison into the right. Behind them, Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Carl Jensen monitored the engine gauges. Radio Operator Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes sat at his station facing the rear of the aircraft, surrounded by radio's codebook's frequencies. In the nose, Bombardier Captain David Kellerman checked his Norden bombsight one last time. Navigator Lieutenant Paul Mendez spread his charts calculating wind speed drift checkpoints. And in the tail, isolated in his own pressurized compartment, Sergeant Raymond Cole sat behind twin 50 caliber machine guns watching the sky. Murphy ran through the checklist: fuel mixture, magnetos, flaps, trim. Everything green. The engines settled into a steady rhythm. Around him across 3 islands the same scene repeated 520 times. Engines roaring. Crews boarding. Ordnance crews pulling away the last safety pins. Ground crews giving thumbs up. The ballet of modern warfare perfectly choreographed. Colonel Preston's voice crackled over the radio. All aircraft, this is Preston. Tonight we write history. Every bomber reaches the target. Every bomb hits the mark. Fly smart, fly safe, bring your crews home. Good hunting. At 1745 the first B-29 began its takeoff roll. Tail number 821, City of San Francisco, piloted by Captain Richard Hayes. The Superfortress accelerated down the runway, engines screaming under full power. At 130 miles per hour the nose lifted. At 150 the main gear left concrete. The bomber climbed into the Pacific, evening a silver speck against the dying light. Behind it the next bomber rolled. Then another. Every 50 seconds another B-29 thundered down the runway. The coordination was flawless. Ground crews had practiced this for months. Fuel trucks, ordnance loaders, maintenance teams, all working in perfect synchronization. Murphy watched the runway. 2 bombers ahead of him. Then 1. Then the flagman waved him forward. Murphy advanced throttles. The Silver Streak rolled onto the runway. He pushed the throttles to the stops. The 4 engines roared defiance. The bomber surged forward, heavy with fuel, heavy with bombs. Airspeed climbed. 100 miles per hour. 120. 140. Murphy eased back on the yoke. The nose lifted. The vibration smoothed. And suddenly they were flying, rising into the warm Pacific air. Morrison retracted the landing gear. Murphy trimmed for climb. Below them Guam shrank into a green dot surrounded by endless blue. Ahead only sky, only ocean, only the mission. The Silver Streak climbed to 8,000 feet and leveled off. Murphy scanned the horizon. Everywhere B-29 silver giants catching the last rays of sunlight. Dozens of them climbing, turning, forming up into loose formations. This was not the tight bomber boxes of Europe. Over the Pacific there was space. Bombers flew in streams separated by miles, by altitude, by time. Less vulnerable to fighters, less likely to collide in clouds. Morrison pointed. Look at that. Murphy followed his gaze. The sky was full of bombers. Hundreds of them. Stretched across 50 miles of ocean, all heading northwest, all bound for Japan. It was beautiful and terrifying. As darkness fell, the formation continued northwest. Inside the Silver Streak, the crew settled into the rhythm of flight. Jensen monitored engines, adjusting fuel mixture, watching temperatures. Hayes listened to radio chatter, relaying weather updates, position reports. Mendez checked his navigation, comparing dead reckoning with celestial sights. Kellerman studied his target folder, memorizing landmarks, approach angles. Cole sat in the tail, watching the empty sky behind them. And Murphy flew, holding altitude, holding course, feeling the steady vibration of the engines, the slight yaw as gusts hit the vertical stabilizer. This was what he knew. This was what he did. Flying into the darkness, carrying destruction. 3 hours into the flight, the first hint of trouble appeared. Static crackled over the radio. Hayes adjusted frequencies, trying to clear the interference. Weather front, Murphy said. We'll fly through it. 20 minutes later they entered clouds. Not the towering thunderheads of the tropics, but a gray murk that swallowed the sky. Visibility dropped to nothing. Murphy flew on instruments. Airspeed, altitude, heading. Trust the gauges. Ignore the vertigo. The bomber shuddered through turbulence. Around them other B-29s vanished into the murk, separated, scattered. But the mission continued. Each bomber flew its own course, navigated by its own crew, trusted to reach the target independently. This was not precision formation flying. This was individual navigation over 1,500 miles of ocean in darkness. Only the best crews could do it. At midnight the clouds broke. Stars appeared, brilliant and cold. Below, the Pacific reflected moonlight, a vast silver mirror. Ahead on the horizon, a faint glow. Japan. Murphy felt his pulse quicken. They were close. Kellerman moved to the bombardier's position in the nose. He could see the glow growing brighter. Landfall in 15 minutes, he called. Murphy acknowledged. He descended to 7,000 feet. Lower altitude made the bomber more vulnerable to flak, but it also made bombing more accurate. And tonight accuracy mattered. They were not hitting a factory. They were burning a district. But even that required precision. The Japanese coast appeared as a dark line against the ocean. Murphy crossed it, flying northwest toward Tokyo. Below, villages and towns slept unaware. In the distance, searchlights probed the sky. Flak began to burst, orange flowers blooming in the darkness. Light flak, mostly 20mm and 40mm fire. More annoying than deadly. The bombers pressed on. Tokyo appeared as a sprawling mass of lights, not the total blackout Murphy had expected. Either the Japanese had given up on blackouts or they couldn't enforce them anymore. Either way, it made navigation easier. Pathfinder aircraft had gone in first, marking the target area with napalm bombs. From altitude, Murphy could see fires already burning. Bright points of flame spreading. More bombers ahead, dropping their loads. The target area lit up like a bonfire. Kellerman called steady. Steady. Bomb bay doors open. The Silver Streak shuddered as the doors swung down. Wind screamed through the open bay. Murphy held course, held altitude. Flak burst closer. The bomber rocked. Kellerman ignored it, focused on the bomb site. The crosshairs aligned. Bombs away. The Silver Streak lurched upwards, suddenly lighter. Behind them, the incendiary clusters tumbled toward Tokyo. They would fall for 30 seconds, then the fuses would trigger, the clusters would break open, releasing the M69 bomblets. Those would punch through roofs, hit the ground, ignite, spray burning napalm. Unstoppable. Murphy banked away, climbing. Below, Tokyo was transforming. What had been scattered fires was becoming a sea of flame. Block after block igniting. The updrafts from the fires were powerful enough to rock the bombers. Smoke rose thousands of feet, black and choking. Morrison stared. My God. Murphy said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had done what they came to do. 520 bombers. Over 3,000 tons of incendiaries. Every 50 seconds another B-29 reached the target, another load of bombs fell. The coordination was merciless. One bomber dropped its load, climbed away, the next arrived. For hours the stream continued unbroken. By 0200 hours the entire Yamanote district was burning. 5.3 square miles engulfed. Flames visible from 50 miles away. The heat so intense that paint on some B-29s blistered. The smoke so thick that later bombers had to climb to 10,000 feet to avoid it. And still they came. Still the bombs fell. Major Murphy turned the Silver Streak southeast toward Guam. Around him other bombers did the same. The return flight was quieter. The adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion. Jensen monitored fuel, calculating whether they had enough to reach base. Hayes sent position reports confirming they were on course. Kellerman sat in the nose staring at nothing. What they had just done would take time to process. Behind them Tokyo burned. The fires would rage for hours, consuming everything. Wood, paper, cloth, flesh. The death toll would be staggering. Hundreds killed. Thousands injured. Tens of thousands homeless. An entire district erased. As dawn broke, Murphy saw Guam on the horizon. The island appeared as a dark smudge against the brightening sky. He descended, lined up on the runway. The Silver Streak touched down gently. Murphy taxied to the hardstand, shut down the engines. Silence. The sudden absence of noise was jarring. For 12 hours the engines had roared. Now nothing. He sat for a moment, hands still on the controls. Morrison looked at him. "We did it, Skipper." Murphy nodded. "Yeah, we did." The ground crew swarmed the bomber, checking for damage, refueling, rearming, preparing for the next mission. Murphy climbed down the ladder. His legs were stiff. His ears rang. He walked across the tarmac toward the debriefing room. Around him other crews were landing. One after another the B-29s returned. Most were undamaged. A few had flak holes patched with metal plates. 2 didn't return at all, lost to mechanical failure or perhaps flak. Out of 520 aircraft, 17 lost, 69 damaged. Acceptable. Brutally acceptable. In the debriefing room Colonel Preston stood before a map. Red pins marked the target area. "Gentleman," Preston said, his voice calm, "tonight you accomplished something unprecedented. 520 bombers. The largest formation ever assembled in the Pacific. You destroyed 5.3 square miles of Tokyo. You killed the enemy's will to fight. You proved that American industry can produce faster than Japan can rebuild. This is what victory looks like." The room was silent. Victory. Murphy thought about the fires. The people trapped in wooden homes. The children. But he pushed the thoughts away. This was war. Total war. And total war had no room for sentiment. Outside the sun climbed into a cloudless sky. Across 3 islands mechanics worked to repair damaged bombers. Ordnance crews loaded more incendiaries. Fuel trucks refilled tanks. In 48 hours they would do it again. And again. Until Japan surrendered or until there was nothing left to burn. Murphy walked to his barracks and collapsed on his bunk. Sleep came quickly, but it was not peaceful. In his dreams he saw Tokyo burning, saw the flames spreading, saw the people running. When he woke hours later the images remained. But the mission was not finished. The May 23rd raid was only the beginning. 2 nights later 464 B-29s returned to Tokyo. They burned another district. And the raids continued through June. Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, Nagoya. City after city. The precision had given way to area bombing. The goal was no longer destroying factories. The goal was destroying the capacity to make war by destroying everything. By August 1945 Japan's major cities were ruins. Industrial production had collapsed. Transportation networks were shattered. Food supplies dwindled. Morale was broken. The B-29 had done what ground forces alone could not. It had brought the war home to Japan. It had shown that hiding behind the Pacific offered no protection. It had demonstrated that American industrial power was unstoppable. And yet, despite the devastation, Japan fought on. The military leadership refused to surrender. They spoke of fighting to the last man. They prepared for an invasion that would cost millions of lives. But the B-29 had one more role to play. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar dropped another on Nagasaki. The age of atomic warfare had begun and the B-29 had delivered it. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Major Thomas Murphy flew his last combat mission on August 14th. It was a conventional raid on a rail yard. By the time he returned, the news had arrived. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Murphy felt relief but also something else. Emptiness. For 2 years his life had been defined by missions, by bombing, by the relentless drive to destroy the enemy. Now it was finished. What came next? He didn't know. In the years after the war, historians would debate the morality of the bombing campaign. Was it necessary? Did it shorten the war? Could Japan have been defeated without burning its cities? The questions would never have clear answers. But one thing was undeniable. The B-29 superfortress had changed warfare forever. It had proved that strategic bombing could win wars. That industrial supremacy mattered more than individual courage. That distance was no longer a defense. The night of May 23, 1945, when 520 B-29s darkened the sky over Tokyo, was not just another raid. It was the moment when Japan understood that defeat was inevitable. That resistance was futile. That the war was already over even if the surrender had not yet been signed. The May 23 raid was not an isolated event. It was part of a calculated campaign that had begun in March. Before Curtis LeMay arrived in the Marianas, the bombing campaign had been failing. B-29s flew at altitudes above 20,000 feet where the newly discovered jet stream winds blew bombs miles off target. Cloud cover obscured targets. Losses were manageable but results were pathetic. Japanese industry continued functioning. Japanese morale remained intact. Something had to change. LeMay changed everything. He was not a man prone to sentiment. He was blunt, profane, utterly focused on results. When he took command in January 1945, he studied the problem coldly. High-altitude precision bombing was not working. The solution was radical. Strip defensive guns from the bombers to carry more bombs. Fly at night at low altitude between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Use incendiaries, not high explosives. Burn entire districts, not individual factories. It was ruthless. It was brutal. But LeMay believed it would work. The test came on the night of March 9th into 10th. Operation Meeting House. 334 B-29s took off for Tokyo carrying incendiary bombs. The Pathfinders arrived first, marking the target with a flaming X. The main force followed, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries. What happened next shocked even the crews who witnessed it. The fires merged into a firestorm. Winds generated by the heat reached hurricane force. Temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees. Asphalt liquefied. Metal melted. People vaporized. In 3 hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. 100,000 civilians died. 1 million were left homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, more deadly than Dresden, more deadly than either atomic bomb that would follow. American losses were 14 bombers. The raid proved incendiaries worked. LeMay had found his weapon. Through April and early May the raids continued. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. City after city burned. But by mid-May LeMay faced a problem. His stockpiles of incendiaries were exhausted. Production was ramping up, but he needed time. The solution was to return to conventional bombing temporarily while waiting for more incendiaries to arrive. Then on May 23, the incendiaries returned in force. 520 B-29s, the largest formation yet assembled in the Pacific. The target was southern Tokyo, the Yamanote district south of the Imperial Palace. This area had been less damaged in previous raids. It contained densely packed neighborhoods interlaced with small factories, workshops, suppliers. When it burned, Japan's industrial capacity would collapse further. The mission briefing on May 22 had been straightforward. Colonel Samuel Preston stood before the assembled crews. Maps covered the walls. Target photos showed wooden buildings packed together. Tomorrow night, Preston said, we return to Tokyo with everything we have. 520 aircraft. Over 3,000 tons of incendiaries. The target is the Yamanote district. It is residential, but it is also industrial. Small factories produce components that feed larger factories. When we burn it, we cripple their war machine. The room was silent. The crews knew what burning a residential district meant. But this was total war. And total war had no room for hesitation. Major Thomas Murphy had spent the day of May 23rd preparing. His crew checked every system on the Silver Streak. Engines, fuel, hydraulics, bomb bay doors. Everything had to be perfect. By late afternoon, the ordnance crews arrived loading the E-46 cluster bombs into the bomb bay. Each cluster contained 38 M69 bomblets. Each M69 was filled with napalm. When released, the clusters would break open at altitude. The bomblets would fall punch through roofs and ignite 3 to 5 seconds later, spraying burning gel. It was efficient. It was terrifying. It was designed to create firestorms. At 1700 hours, the engines started. The familiar roar of the Wright R-3350s filled the air. Murphy and Morrison ran through the pre-flight checklist. Behind them, Jensen monitored gauges. Hayes checked radios. In the nose, Kellerman and Mendez prepared navigation and bombing equipment. In the tail, Cole loaded his guns. The crew was ready. At 1730, the first bomber rolled. Captain Richard Hayes in City of San Francisco lifted off into the Pacific evening. Behind him, bombers followed at 50-second intervals. The coordination was flawless. 520 B-29s taking off from 3 islands converging on a single target. It was a demonstration of industrial might that Japan could not match. The Silver Streak took off at 18:15. Murphy felt the familiar surge as the engines pushed the heavy bomber down the runway. The nose lifted. The wheels left concrete. They were flying. Climbing to 8,000 feet, Murphy turned northwest. Around him, the sky filled with bombers. Everywhere he looked, silver shapes caught the fading sunlight. It was beautiful in a terrible way. This was not a military formation flying to strike a military target. This was an industrial process. 520 machines carrying destruction programmed to obliterate a city. Efficient. Relentless. Unstoppable. The flight to Japan took 6 hours. Inside the Silver Streak, the crew settled into routine. Jensen monitored fuel flow, adjusting mixture. Hayes listened to radio traffic, weather updates, position reports. Mendez calculated wind drift, updating the navigation. Kellerman reviewed target photos, memorizing landmarks. Murphy flew, holding altitude, holding heading. The Pacific stretched below, dark and empty. Above, stars filled the sky. It was peaceful. It was surreal. In a few hours they would be over Tokyo, burning a city. But for now, only the steady vibration of engines and the hum of instruments. At midnight, the Japanese coast appeared. A dark line against the darker ocean. Murphy descended to 7,000 feet. Lower altitude meant more accurate bombing. It also meant more vulnerability to flak. But intelligence indicated Japanese defenses were collapsing. Fuel shortages had grounded most fighters. Anti-aircraft ammunition was running low. The risk was calculated and acceptable. The bombers pressed on. Ahead, Tokyo glowed. Not the full illumination of peacetime, but a dull orange glow. Previous raids had left parts of the city burning. Tonight would add to the destruction. Pathfinder aircraft had gone in first. Their mission was to mark the target area with incendiaries forming an X pattern visible from altitude. As Murphy approached, he could see the markers clearly. Bright flames in the darkness. Around them, fires were already spreading. The bombers ahead had dropped their loads. The district was beginning to burn. Kellerman moved to the bombardier position in the nose. He could see the target clearly. The X marked the center. Around it, densely packed neighborhoods. Steady, Murphy said. Bomb bay doors open. The doors swung down. Wind roared through the open bay. Murphy held course. Flak burst around them. Orange flowers blooming in the darkness. The bomber shuddered. A near miss. Morrison tensed. Murphy flew on. Steady, Kellerman called. Bombs away. The Silver Streak lurched upwards, suddenly 8 tons lighter. Behind them, the cluster bombs tumbled toward Tokyo. They would fall for 20 seconds, then the fuses would trigger. The clusters would break open. The M69 bomblets would separate, punch through roofs, ignite, spray napalm. Unstoppable. Murphy banked away climbing. Below Tokyo was transforming. What had been scattered fires was becoming a sea of flame. The heat rising from the burning district created updrafts powerful enough to toss bombers around like toys. Morrison gripped his seat. Jesus, Murphy. Murphy said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had done what they came to do. 520 bombers. Every 50 seconds another aircraft reached the target, another load of bombs fell. For hours the stream continued. One bomber dropped its load, climbed away, the next arrived. The coordination was merciless. By 0200 hours southern Tokyo was an inferno. 5.3 square miles burning. The heat so intense that crews flying over the target at 8,000 feet felt it through the fuselage. The smoke so thick that later bombers had to climb to avoid it. And still they came. Still the bombs fell. This was not warfare as previous generations had known it. This was industrial annihilation. The return flight was quieter. The adrenaline faded, replaced by exhaustion and something else. Murphy stared at the instruments. Behind him in the waist position, Staff Sergeant William Bannon sat in silence. He had watched through the observation window as Tokyo burned. The fires stretched for miles. The smoke rose thousands of feet. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. When they landed hours later, Bannon would write in his journal, "I saw a city die tonight. I don't know how to feel about it." But feeling was a luxury combatants could not afford. There would be time for reflection later. If they survived. As dawn broke, Murphy saw Guam on the horizon. He descended, lined up on the runway. The silver streak touched down gently. The arrestor hook caught. The bomber rolled to a stop. Murphy shut down the engines. Silence. After 12 hours of constant engine noise, the quiet was jarring. He sat for a moment, hands still on the controls. They had survived. Again. Around him the other crews were landing. One after another the B-29s returned. Of 520 aircraft dispatched, 17 had been lost. 69 damaged. The losses were acceptable. Brutally acceptable. Because the mission had succeeded. Southern Tokyo had burned. Japanese industrial capacity had been crippled further. And the war moved one step closer to its inevitable conclusion. 2 days later they did it again. May 25th. 502 B-29s. This time the target was central Tokyo, including areas near government ministries. The raid destroyed 16.8 square miles. It damaged the main building of the Imperial Palace, though the crews had been briefed not to target it directly. The American government did not want to risk killing Emperor Hirohito. Not yet. Not while there was still hope he might facilitate surrender. The May raids marked a turning point. Before them Japan had believed it could endure. After them belief crumbled. The sheer scale of destruction was overwhelming. Not just the fires, not just the casualties, but the relentless industrial rhythm of it. Every few days another raid. Every raid hundreds of bombers. Every bomber tons of incendiaries. The math was brutal. American factories were producing B-29s faster than Japan could shoot them down. American industry was manufacturing incendiaries faster than Japan could rebuild. The war had become a contest of industrial capacity, and Japan had already lost. Major Murphy flew missions through June and July. Each one similar. Take off from Guam, fly 6 hours to Japan, drop incendiaries, fly 6 hours back. The targets changed. Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama. Smaller cities. But the pattern remained constant. Burn the cities. Cripple industry. Break morale. By late July Murphy had flown 32 combat missions. He was exhausted. His hands shook. He had trouble sleeping. When he did sleep he dreamed of fires. But the mission continued because there was no alternative. Japan refused to surrender, and so the bombing continued. In early August the atomic bombs fell. Hiroshima on August 6th. Nagasaki on August 9th. Murphy did not fly those missions, but he understood their significance. The B-29 had delivered not just conventional destruction but atomic annihilation. The age of nuclear warfare had begun, and the superfortress had ushered it in. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Murphy flew his last combat mission on August 14, a conventional raid. By the time he returned to Guam, the news had arrived. The war was over. Murphy felt relief, but also something he could not name. For 2 years his life had been defined by one purpose: destroy Japan's capacity to wage war. He had done it. They had all done it. But the cost in human lives was staggering. Conservative estimates put Japanese civilian deaths from the bombing campaign at 330,000. Other estimates ran higher. 8.5 million people were left homeless. 66 cities had been bombed. 178 square miles burned. The numbers were so large they became abstract. But Murphy had seen the fires. He had smelled the smoke. He knew what those numbers represented. People, families, children, all dead because war demanded it. In the years after, historians debated the morality of the campaign. Was it necessary? Did it shorten the war? Could Japan have been defeated without burning its cities? The questions had no clear answers. LeMay himself never expressed remorse. When asked years later about the firebombing, he said bluntly, "If we had lost the war, we would all have been prosecuted as war criminals. But we won. And so we wrote the history." Murphy was less certain. He understood the strategic logic. Japan had to be defeated. Invasion would have cost millions of lives, American and Japanese. The bombing campaign offered an alternative. Bring the war home to Japan. Show them that continued resistance was futile. Make surrender the only rational choice. From that perspective, the campaign succeeded. Japan surrendered. The invasion never happened. Lives were saved. But lives were also taken. And Murphy would carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of his life. The legacy of the B-29 and the strategic bombing campaign against Japan is complex. On one hand, the superfortress proved that long-range strategic bombing could win wars. It demonstrated that industrial supremacy mattered more than individual valor. It showed that distance was no longer a defense. Japan had believed the vastness of the Pacific would protect it. The B-29 proved that belief wrong. From the Marianas, American bombers could reach any target in Japan. They could fly in formations so large that Japanese defenses were overwhelmed. They could carry enough bombs to burn entire cities. And they could do it repeatedly because American industry could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. But the legacy is also darker. The strategic bombing campaign deliberately targeted civilian populations. The goal was not just to destroy factories but to break morale. To make the Japanese people understand that continued war meant continued destruction. LeMay and his planners knew that burning residential districts would kill civilians. They accepted that as necessary. The official justification was that Japanese industry was dispersed throughout residential areas. Small workshops and factories operated in homes and neighborhoods. Therefore, bombing those areas was legitimate. But the distinction between military and civilian targets blurred. When you drop incendiaries on a densely populated district, you cannot avoid killing civilians. And the planners knew it. The May 23 raid exemplified this reality. 520 bombers. Over 3,000 tons of incendiaries. The target was described as an industrial district. But it was also home to hundreds of thousands of people. When the bombs fell, those people died. Not soldiers. Not factory workers necessarily. Mothers. Fathers, children, elderly, all incinerated because they lived in a district that contained targets. The moral calculus was brutal. Kill civilians now to end the war sooner. Accept that evil to prevent greater evil. Whether that calculus was correct remains debated. What is undeniable is that it was made. And it was executed with industrial efficiency. The B-29 itself was a technological marvel. At the time, it was the most advanced bomber in the world. Pressurized cabin. Remote-controlled gun turrets. Analog fire control computers. 4 powerful engines. Range exceeding 3,000 miles. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it. It could carry 10 tons of bombs and fight its way through enemy defenses. By war's end, it had dropped 170,000 tons of bombs on Japan. It had flown 33,000 sorties. It had destroyed 66 cities. Its kill ratio against Japanese fighters was favorable. Its survivability was high. It was everything a strategic bomber should be. Powerful, reliable, deadly. But technology is neutral. The B-29 was a tool. How it was used depended on the men who commanded it and the strategic situation that demanded its use. In Europe, American bombers targeted factories, rail yards, oil refineries. In Japan, they burned cities. The difference was not the aircraft but the strategy. And the strategy reflected a judgment that total war against Japan required total destruction. Whether that judgment was correct, whether it was moral, whether it was necessary, these questions have no easy answers. What is clear is that the May 23, 1945 raid with 520 bombers darkening the sky was a demonstration of industrial power so absolute it changed how wars would be fought forever. After the war, the B-29 continued to serve. It flew in Korea. It formed the backbone of America's early nuclear deterrent. Strategic Air Command B-29s carried atomic bombs standing ready to strike the Soviet Union if war came. Eventually, it was replaced by more advanced bombers. The B-36, the B-47, the B-52. But the superfortress had established the template. Long-range strategic bombers capable of delivering massive destruction. Nuclear or conventional. The doctrine of strategic bombing that the B-29 proved effective in World War II shaped military thinking for decades. For the men who flew the May 23 mission, the memory remained vivid. Major Murphy retired from the Air Force in 1953. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about the war. When asked, he would say simply, "We did what we had to do." But in private moments he thought about Tokyo. About the fires. About the people who died. He understood intellectually that the bombing was necessary, that it saved lives by ending the war sooner. But understanding did not erase the images. The city burning. The smoke rising. The knowledge that beneath those flames people were dying. That knowledge never left him. Captain David Kellerman, the bombardier, stayed in the Air Force and flew in Korea. He was shot down over North Korea in 1951 and spent 2 years as a prisoner of war. When he returned, he left the service. He became a teacher. He never spoke publicly about the firebombing missions. To his students, he was simply Mr. Kellerman, who taught history and sometimes mentioned he had served in the war. But he never mentioned Tokyo. Never mentioned the bomb runs. Never mentioned watching cities burn. Those memories were his alone to carry. Lieutenant James Morrison Murphy's co-pilot returned to civilian life after the war. He became an engineer, worked for Boeing designing aircraft. The irony was not lost on him. He had flown bombers that destroyed cities. Now he designed planes that built them. When colleagues asked about his war service, he spoke generally about flying B-29s. He did not mention the incendiary raids. He did not mention May 23. Some things he believed were better left unsaid. Staff Sergeant William Bannon, the man who had written in his journal, "I saw a city die tonight," returned to his family in Ohio. He worked in a factory. He married. He raised children. He lived an ordinary life. But the memories never faded. On quiet nights he would think about that mission. About watching Tokyo burn from 8,000 feet. About the sheer scale of destruction. About the knowledge that his bomber, his crew, had contributed to it. He told his children stories about the war. But not those stories. Those he kept locked inside. The Japanese who survived the May 23 raid carried different memories. For them it was not a strategic necessity or a military operation. It was apocalypse. The night the sky rained fire. The night their world ended. Survivors spoke of heat so intense it melted metal. Of winds so powerful they tore people off their feet. Of fires that moved faster than anyone could run. Of shelters that became ovens cooking everyone inside. Of canals filled with bodies of people who had jumped into the water to escape the flames only to boil alive. These memories haunted Japanese survivors for the rest of their lives. Haruyo Naihai was 8 years old on May 23. She lived in the Yamanote district with her parents and siblings. When the air raid sirens sounded, they went to a shelter as they always did. But this night was different. The fires spread faster than anyone expected. The heat became unbearable. Her father made a decision. They would run. They fled through streets filled with flames. Buildings collapsing. People screaming. The roar of bombers overhead. They ran all night. When dawn came they were alive but their home was gone. Their neighborhood was gone. Everything they knew had been incinerated. Nihai carried those memories for 70 years. In interviews late in her life she spoke about the terror. About the guilt of surviving when so many died. About the anger at the country that did this to her city. But also about understanding. Understanding that war is horror. That both sides suffered. That the only lesson is that it must never happen again. The May 23rd raid was not unique. It was one of many. But it symbolized something larger. It was the moment when strategic bombing reached its fullest expression. 520 bombers in a single night. Over 3,000 tons of incendiaries. 5.3 square miles destroyed. It was industrial warfare perfected. The coordination. The logistics. The sheer scale. No other nation in 1945 could have mounted such an operation. Not Germany. Not Britain. Not the Soviet Union. Only America, with its vast industrial base, its technological prowess, its logistical mastery, could send 520 bombers 1,500 miles across an ocean, drop their bombs and return. And do it again 2 days later. And again. And again. Until the enemy surrendered. This was the reality that shocked Japan. Not just the destruction, though that was terrible, but the relentless industrial rhythm of it. The knowledge that American factories could produce bombers faster than Japanese guns could shoot them down. That American pilots were being trained faster than Japanese pilots could replace losses. That every resource, every advantage was on America's side. Japan in May 1945 was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Fuel shortages grounded fighters. Ammunition shortages left anti-aircraft guns silent. Pilot shortages meant green recruits with minimal training were thrown into combat. Meanwhile, America grew stronger. More bombers. More pilots. More bombs. The balance was not just unfavorable. It was impossible. And so when 520 B-29s darkened the sky over Tokyo on the night of May 23rd, it was more than a raid. It was a message. This is what American industrial power means. This is what happens when you fight a nation that can outproduce you 10-1. This is why surrender is inevitable. Some in Japan's government understood. They saw the writing on the wall. The war was lost. Continued fighting served no purpose except to increase the death toll. But others clung to hope. Hope that determination could overcome industry. That spirit could defeat machines. That somehow Japan could turn the tide. The May raids extinguished that hope. After 520 bombers, there could be no illusions. The war was over. All that remained was to accept it. Japan's surrender 3 months later vindicated the strategic bombing campaign in the eyes of its planners. The atomic bombs delivered the final blow, but the conventional firebombing had laid the groundwork. By August, Japan's cities were ruins. Its industry was crippled. Its people were exhausted and demoralized. The government was divided between those who wanted to fight to the end and those who sought peace. The atomic bombs tipped the scales. But without the months of conventional bombing, without the systematic destruction of Japan's industrial base, without the breaking of civilian morale, the atomic bombs alone might not have been enough. The strategic bombing campaign and the B-29 had made surrender possible. For Major Thomas Murphy and the thousands like him who flew those missions, the vindication was cold comfort. They had done their duty. They had followed orders. They had helped win the war. But the cost in human lives weighed on them. In later years, Murphy would say, "I don't regret what we did. I regret that it was necessary." That distinction mattered to him. He had not wanted to burn cities. He had not wanted to kill civilians. But war had demanded it. And so he had done it. The alternative was to let the war continue. To invade Japan. To fight street by street. To accept millions of casualties, American and Japanese. Against that calculus, burning cities seemed the lesser evil. Whether it actually was remains debated. But for Murphy and his generation, it was the choice they made. And they lived with it. The night of May 23, 1945 stands as a testament to industrial warfare at its peak. 520 bombers. 520 crews. Over 5,800 men. All coordinated in a single operation. All focused on a single goal. Destroy the enemy's capacity to wage war. The execution was flawless. The results were devastating. And the message was clear. This is what modern war looks like. Not cavalry charges. Not infantry assaults. Not even tank battles. But bombers darkening the sky. Incendiaries falling like rain. Cities burning. And behind it all the unstoppable engine of industrial production. Factories churning out planes. Training schools graduating pilots. Supply chains delivering fuel and bombs. All working in perfect synchronization. This was America's strength. And it was a strength that Japan could not match. The legacy continues today. When we speak of strategic bombing, we reference the campaigns of World War II. When we discuss deterrence, we remember the B-29s carrying atomic bombs. When we debate the morality of targeting civilians, we return to Tokyo, Dresden, Hiroshima. These questions remain relevant because the fundamental tension remains. How do you fight a total war without total destruction? How do you defeat an enemy without destroying their society? The B-29 raids offered one answer. Bring overwhelming force. Make continued resistance pointless. Force surrender through sheer destruction. It worked, but at terrible cost. And the ghosts of that cost haunt us still. For Japan, the May 23rd raid was one nightmare among many. But it represented the moment when the abstract became concrete. Before that night, Japanese citizens could believe the propaganda. That Japan was winning. That America was weakening. That determination would prevail. After that night, no illusions remained. 520 bombers were not an aberration. They were not a desperate gamble. They were routine. A demonstration of capability so vast it defied comprehension. And if America could send 520 bombers in one night, what would stop them from sending 1,000? Or 2,000? The logic was inescapable. And it led to only one conclusion. Surrender. The sun rose on May 24th over a transformed Tokyo. Where neighborhoods had stood were ashes. Where families had lived were ruins. 5.3 square miles of the city simply gone. Tens of thousands dead. Hundreds of thousands homeless. The scale of destruction was medieval, but the method was modern. No army had marched through the streets. No soldiers had set fires. Machines had done it. Flying machines guided by men who never saw the faces of their victims. This was the new reality of war. Distance no longer protected. Civilians were no longer safe. And industrial capacity mattered more than military valor. In the years since, historians have tried to make sense of it. Was the strategic bombing campaign against Japan justified? Did it shorten the war? Did it save lives? The answers depend on assumptions about what would have happened otherwise. If Japan had been invaded, American casualties would have been enormous. Perhaps hundreds of thousands. Japanese casualties would have been catastrophic. Perhaps millions. Against that, the bombing campaign with its 330,000 civilian deaths seemed the lesser evil. But if Japan would have surrendered anyway, if diplomatic efforts could have succeeded, then the bombing was unnecessary mass killing. The truth is unknowable. We cannot replay history with different choices. We can only judge based on what happened. And what happened is that the bombing campaign broke Japan's will to fight. Whether it was the only way or the best way, we will never know. What we do know is that the night of May 23, 1945, 520 B-29 superfortresses took off from the Mariana Islands, flew 1,500 miles, dropped over 3,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo and returned. 17 were lost. Thousands survived. And Tokyo burned. It was the largest single daylight raid of the Pacific War, larger even than the famous March 10th raid. It demonstrated American industrial supremacy. It proved strategic bombing could devastate enemy cities. And it brought Japan one step closer to inevitable surrender. For the crews who flew it, it was a mission like any other. Take off, fly, drop bombs, return. For the Japanese who endured it, it was apocalypse. For history, it was a turning point. The moment when industrial warfare reached its fullest terrible expression. And the moment when Japan realized that the war was already over. The sky darkened that morning, not with clouds but with steel. 520 machines built in American factories, flown by American crews carrying American bombs. It was a sight that would have seemed impossible just years before. But by May 1945 it was routine. And that more than anything demonstrated why Japan had already lost. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage. Not because Japanese industry lacked skill. But because the sheer scale of American production was overwhelming. You cannot win a war when your enemy can build planes faster than you can shoot them down. You cannot win when every loss they suffer is replaced within days while your losses are permanent. You cannot win when the sky itself becomes your enemy. And so the war ended. Not with a single decisive battle. Not with a grand invasion. But with fire falling from the sky. Night after night. City after city. Until nothing remained but surrender. The B-29 had done what ground forces could not. It had brought the war home to Japan. It had shown that resistance was futile. And it had written the final chapter of World War II in smoke and flame. The men who flew those missions carried the weight of what they had done for the rest of their lives. The people who survived carried scars that never healed. And history recorded that on May 23, 1945, humanity learned what industrial war truly meant. It meant 500 bombers darkening the sky. It meant cities burning. It meant the future would be different. And it meant that some lessons are written in fire and never forgotten.